Okay, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight on this rather unfortunately rainy Tuesday. This is May. I am the Deputy Director of Education and History here at the Capitol Building. But long before that, I worked seasonally at the historic sites on Mackinac Island. And while the Capitol and Mackinac, obviously very different places, the longer I spend here, the more similarities I find between these two locations. They are both very small, kind of insular communities. They have their own very specific vocabularies and peculiar traditions, and sometimes kind of obscure protocols that you don't know anything about until you become kind of part of that little world. And yet, both of these places really exist to open themselves up to the outside world. Lansing, of course, and the capital as the seat of state government, and Mackinac first as a fur trading center and then as a tourist destination. They are both gathering places. They play host to the rest of the state. And in that way, both these locations have become kind of emblematic of Michigan as a whole and have sort of an outsized presence in the state's history. They serve as these sort of focal points when you're looking at the broader story of our state. So tonight we're going to look at some of the connections, some of the links between these focal points. And we're going to specifically talk mostly about the period between about the 1870s to the 1990s. Not that this story doesn't continue before and after those dates, but frankly, no one wants to be here all night. This is a very dense history. And if there are things that I've left out of here, it may be something that I have not discovered yet myself, or maybe it just didn't quite fit into the limited narrative that we have going on tonight. So to begin with, a quick note on geography and spelling. If you have seen our orientation room exhibits here in Heritage Hall, you know that capital with an O is a building, capital with an A is a city. So when I say the summer capital is Mackinac, I mean like the general community, the area, not any specific building. Similarly, the Mackinac region, about 230 some miles north of Lansing, between the lower and upper peninsulas, that is always spelt with a C. Mackinac area is a C. The Straits of Mackinac between Lake Huron and Lake Michigan are a C. Mackinac Island is with a C. The only time Mackinac is spelt with a W at the end is referring to Mackinac City, the northernmost town on the very tip of that lower peninsula. And St. Ignace is its northern counterpart on the other side of the Mackinac Bridge. And you'll hear me refer to all these locations tonight. We talk about the island a lot, just because, again, that's kind of what I know most about, but also mostly just the area as a whole. So to start off with, in the 1870s, this is very much kind of, these are formative years for Lansing and for Mackinac. The third capital, our current capital, is in the process of being built, which is very much sort of firming up Lansing's role as the real official permanent seat of government. Meanwhile, Mackinac is starting to emerge as a popular travel destination. In the late 19th century, travel is becoming a little bit easier as railroads and shipping are expanding. And especially in like the post-Civil War era, there's a sort of renewed sense of patriotism. And there's this feeling like we need to appreciate the sites of historic importance and natural beauty within our own country, right? Oop, my computer was panicking a little bit there, sorry. These are features that Mackinac really has in spades. It's already known for being a really beautiful area, and it's been popular for a while. And by 1875, the island's prominence is such that there is a sense that this historic significance, this natural beauty, should be protected for the benefit of the public. And so the U.S. Congress establishes Mackinac National Park, the only second national park in the country, second to Yellowstone. And the driving force behind the creation of the national park was Thomas Ferry. He was actually born on Mackinac Island. His father was Reverend William Ferry, who ran a Protestant mission there in the early 19th century. You can see the mission house in a later life as a hotel in the image there. Ferry spent quite a bit of time in Lansing in the second capital. He was in the state legislature, and by the time the national park idea is rolling around, he is in the U.S. Senate. And at its creation, the national park consists of 911 acres of land on Mackinac Island, plus what they called the military reserve, the actual fort on the island, Fort Mackinac, and some surrounding buildings. And it's important to note that this was still an active military fort at the time. So the parklands were maintained by U.S. Army soldiers and officers. And this arrangement works out great till 1894 when the Army realizes, why are we spending money to take care of a national park? We're going to leave. We're going to sell off this land now because there's not really a lot of military purpose in us being here. And this causes a little consternation in Michigan. There is a sense that the presence of the fort is kind of part of the island's attraction to visitors. I also feel like the local folks on the island probably did not want to start paying for all the services that the federal government was providing with the national parks. So another US senator kind of steps in to help transfer those federal lands to the state. James McMillan, whose portrait we happen to have upstairs in the Capitol building, he kind of works out a deal with the Secretary of War to give the parklands over to the state of Michigan, like upon request of the governor. In McMillan's kind of message to Governor John Rich, he suggests that the state can use the island for military purposes and maintain the park as New York maintains Niagara. And as I mentioned, those military purposes aren't too military. Mackinac was occupied in the War of 1812, like Detroit was, but 1812 is quite a long time ago by 1895. It's not a big concern. But of course, the state is still operating a state militia at this point. And the military officers, like the adjutant general, these are quite prominent people in state government. So it's possible McMillan was thinking that the state militias could maybe use the island for some use. There could be some practical going on there. So in 1895, John Rich officially requests the transfer of the land, and this creates Michigan's very first state park. And then, of course, the state government has to go about finding out how you run a state park. We've never done this before. And as they often do, the state legislature creates a commission to deal with that. The first Mackinac Island State Park Commission had 5 members appointed by the governor. And some of these will be familiar names in Lansing history. Thomas Ferry is there again. He's a former senator by this point, as well as William Clark, who was a longtime Lansing newspaper editor, and Peter White, who was another legislator in the 1850s and was a very prominent businessman, philanthropist in the Upper Peninsula. And the next year, the Park Commission gets their very first employee, Homer Lockwood Thayer. He is the first superintendent of Mackinac Island State Park. He was actually a former Capitol employee who worked for the State Board of Health for a number of years. Also a very prominent veteran. He fought for the 3rd Michigan Infantry in the Civil War. So again, we see kind of a little reflection on that sort of military connection that they feel is appropriate for Mackinac Island. And with the job, Thayer also got the use of a cottage on Mackinac and a bicycle. Very important piece of Mackinac Island equipment. It is important to note that the park did not get any regular appropriations till 1903. So funding or lack thereof is a big part of the park's early history. And the way that they were making money at this point was by selling leases on park lands for some of the wealthier visitors to build their summer cottages, as they would say. And cottages is definitely a word in quotes there. They are cottages in the sense they are summer homes, not cottages in the sense they're very small and very humble. So they're renting out this land. This is actually something that the federal government started. This is something the national park did. So the state just kind of continued that process. And we'll be discussing a couple of these cottages later on in the program too. And this is not the only construction going on the island at the time, because of course, more tourism, more visitors means more business. So restaurants and hotels and saloons and shops are all popping up downtown. There's a lot of new kind of businesses starting up. And one of these enterprising business owners was a Mrs. Emma Ford, who ran a restaurant slash bakery slash catering service on the island. You can see they're out there with her delivery wagon out in front of her restaurant. And there's a good chance that she knew about the kind of influx of new visitors to Mackinac because her husband, Joseph Ford, was a porter for the Grand Rapids and Indiana Railroad, also happened to be a longtime keeper of the Senate cloakroom. So he'd be working on the Senate floor and in the rooms connected to it, talking to legislators and governors and all their staff. So they become really fixtures of both the kind of Lansing community and the Mackinac community. Emma Ford would often advertise in northern newspapers like the Petoskey Resorter. And in this little article, they call her island the very best place to eat, her restaurant the very best place to eat on the island. And they say that if there is anyone at Mackinac Island who is chock full of business, it is Joe Ford, or Senator as he is best known, and his wife. Mrs. Ford doesn't need a bit of help to keep the restaurant business on the boom, even when the senator is away, and there's always a lively air of business about the popular dining parlors. So you get the sense that this is the time, this turn of the century is when the Mackinac that we know it is starting to develop. And a lot of the people who are creating this new environment, they have ties, formal and informal, to state government. And in the following decades, the park commissioners and other people involved in Michigan politics, they start kind of marketing the island specifically as a political destination. The first time I hear Mackinac referred to as like the summer capital, it's actually in reference to the national capital. This is 1911. There was an effort that year to get President Taft to come and visit. This is spearheaded by Edwin Wood, who was on the Democratic National Committee at the time, also happened to have his own home on Mackinac Island. And I think it probably had something to do with the fact that Governor Chase Osborne vetoed all the parks appropriations that year. So they may have been looking for a little extra support somewhere else. And ultimately, this attempt fails, but it is the first of several presidential invitations that the park extends. In 1927, they give President Coolidge a big album of photographs and pictures and information about the island. You can see him receiving that album here. Doesn't he look thrilled about it? And they try again in the 1930s with FDR. The park actually still has Roosevelt's Mackinac album that they gifted to him. Ultimately, though, these attempts are not super successful, and the only time a sitting president visits the island is in 1975 when Gerald Ford comes to visit. And of course, that was not his first time there. We'll talk more about that in a moment. The island, though, has better luck with governors. In 1927, Governor Fred Greene brings national attention to Mackinac by holding a governor's conference at the Grand Hotel. And he also starts what is now called the Scout Service Camp at Mackinac, basically kind of enlisting Boy Scouts from around Michigan to come and stay for a while on the island. And they act as sort of like guards/guides at the fort and the historic spots and help out visitors. And one of these scouts happens to be a 16-year-old Jerry Ford. So he already knew the island very well by the time he came back as president. And Greene's kind of enthusiasm for Mackinac, I think, does make sense with the rest of his career. He was an avid outdoorsman, which you could probably tell by his portrait, now on display in the Conservation Lab in Heritage Hall, if you want to see it. And he kind of saw the benefit of preserving lands for recreation and understood that tourism was a good way to capitalize on that land. And another one of his interests was improving Michigan's roads. This was a long discussion for the state government in the 1920s as automobiles are becoming more and more popular. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that cars really change everything for Michigan, and they especially change tourism. It means that more people are traveling across the state, and they need a whole new infrastructure to travel on. And of course, they start looking for ways to get those cars across the Straits of Mackinac. The earliest way they could actually do that was via railroad ferry. In 1881, a group of Midwest railroads founds a joint venture to shuttle rail cars across the straits. And slowly they also start taking on automobiles and just passengers, like foot traffic. And this works for a while, but as more people start using the service, there starts to be a lot of complaints about the exorbitant rates charged by the railroads. And the state decides to step in 1922. At that point, the state was completing what they called the trunk line between from going from like the Upper Peninsula straight north to Mackinac City and then on to St. Ignace. So the highway commissioner at the time, Frank Rogers, came up with the idea of a state-run ferry service to take cars across the water for the people who would be using this new trunk line. The next year, the governor negotiates the purchase of a couple of ships from the federal government, and the ferry service kind of become a fixture at the straits for the next 30 years. Their fleet kind of grows and grows and grows, and they still have trouble keeping up with traffic as tourism is increasing, especially on busy occasions, notably like summer holiday weekends, and of course the hunting season. Very important holiday at the capital as well, that one. And Mackinac Island, speaking of cars, notoriously does not allow them, with the exception for emergency vehicles and a few special licenses for like utility vehicles and snowmobiles. This ban actually dates all the way back to 1898 when the Park Commission decided to ban automobiles on state property, which is most of the island. It seems the ban wasn't like super strictly enforced in the early years, and there were a few island people who had property on the island who brought their cars with them. But by the 20s, questions start to arise about whether or not Mackinac Island should really get with the times and let the tourists drive their cars over there. And this idea is addressed by Frank Kenyon, who is a longtime superintendent of Mackinac Island State Park and a very short-time superintendent of the state capitol. His idea is to create a parking area on the north side of the island, the area they call British Landing, and people could ride the state ferry over, leave their car, do a little tourist stuff, get their car back, and continue on to St. Ignace. And ultimately, the dock in that area is built, but the parking lot never emerges. It seems this was not a super popular idea with a lot of folks on the island, and most importantly, was not very popular with Governor Grosbeck. But the car debate doesn't really go away. It comes up again in the 1930s. And by then, of course, the state's dealing with a very different economy. With the Depression, there's many fewer people who are actually traveling to Mackinac. And they thought maybe if we let you bring your cars over, it'll coax a few more visitors here. And Governor Fitzgerald kind of took an interest in the car debate. He visited Mackinac in 1935, specifically to consider ways to stimulate Michigan tourism. This little article from the Capitol Bulletin says that the governor had barely got settled on the island when the controversy began on whether automobiles should be permitted to purr over the roads kept sacred for the horse and buggy. The governor favored the horses and spent a goodly amount of time driving one while there. And Governor Fitzgerald evidently enjoyed Mackinac. He made return visits throughout his time in office, and his family maintained connections to Mackinac through many generations of service to the state. His family ended up purchasing a cottage on the island there in the 1960s. Was probably frequented quite a bit by his son, John Fitzgerald, who ended up being on the Michigan Supreme Court. He was Chief Justice of the Michigan Supreme Court. And his son, Frank, and his son, John Wesley Fitzgerald, both worked at Fort Mackinac on the island as young men before going on to serve in the state legislature. And one of Fitzgerald's kind of favorite sort of Mackinac compatriots was Wilfred Doyle. You can see here, the king of Mackinac Island, as he was called. He was on the State Park Commission for forever. First, kind of given that spot by Fitzgerald and reappointed by 8 different governors through the years. And Wilfred Doyle had his own home on Mackinac. He would summer there, and in the wintertime, he was lobbying at the state capitol. That was his profession. And this is a very useful skill, especially in the mid-20th century when the state park is surviving on some pretty meager legislative appropriations. So Doyle becomes kind of really one of the most tenacious supporters for the island in general, and specifically the state park. And it is actually thanks to Doyle that we end up with the governor's residence on Mackinac Island. Now, if you're wondering where all these governors were staying at before we got this house for them, they would usually use one of the buildings at Fort Mackinac, one of the old officers' quarters there. And so it would be a Victorian era building, but also important to note, it would be Victorian military housing. So it's a pretty modest setup. But in 1944, Governor Harry Kelly is planning another governor's conference on the island, and Doyle seems to get the idea that he needs a nicer place to host from during this event. And it just so happens that quite a few of the cottages had also suffered from the Depression economics. And what they called the Young Cottage, just west of Fort Mackinac, was for sale that year. So Doyle manages to get a hold of a $15,000 appropriation to buy the property, as well as permission to get prison labor to come up and make some very necessary repairs before the conference starts. So the following year, in 1945, they finished that up, and the governor's conference begins, and the Young Cottage is officially kind of handed over to Michigan's governors. And of course, visits to Mackinac kind of become part of the business of government in Michigan, and their comings and goings on the island are often reported on in the press. I think this kind of reporting is interesting because it just shows clearly that people considered the work for Michigan's public officials to continue far beyond the walls of the Capitol. And there was definitely kind of a general consensus that sometimes that work could take place more efficiently in buildings that are not necessarily the Capitol or necessarily a state office building. Sometimes it's easier to have conversations in a quiet Lansing restaurant or at a relaxed weekend on the island. And of course, it's not just governors that appreciate this sort of leisure politicking, let's call it. All sorts of different advocacy groups and branches of the state political associations and charities and social clubs and fraternities had been coming to Mackinac for decades. And in the 20th century, they increasingly are going to the Grand Hotel. I've mentioned the Grand a couple of times. They hosted both those governors' conferences. They're the biggest, most famous hotel on the island. They have a really, really huge property, and they kind of grow a reputation as a convention center. And there's this sort of sense of a shared community between the Grand Hotel and the Capitol building that kind of comes up at this time. And one of the members of this community was photographer Ed Fry, who is the staff photographer for the Grand Hotel and for the Hotel Olds here in Lansing, literally right across the street from the Capitol building. So during legislative session, Ed Fry would be down in Lansing taking photos of events at the Olds Hotel and at the Capitol. You can see one of his pictures of the House chamber in here. And then in the summertime, he would be on Mackinac Island, probably taking pictures of a lot of the same powerful people. And the Grand kind of still maintains a lot of its political influence. In 1981, the Detroit Regional Chamber began hosting their annual conference at the Grand Hotel, and that has kind of grown into being sort of the premier political event at the Capitol building. That's where everybody's got to go in the springtime to get what they need to get done. And of course, as in this sort of with this reputation as sort of a political haunt, the Grand has quite a bit of influence in Michigan politics. We'll see that come to play a little bit later. And their influence only grows as Michigan starts to really kind of take an interest in the tourism industry. Around the time we get a hold of the governor's residence in 1944, Governor Kelly creates the Michigan Tourist and Resort Commission with the express purpose of marketing the state to travelers. The commission runs 4 offices where tourists can come and get information, or they can actually write in requests. And notably, their main branch was on the ground floor of the Capitol from about 1947 to 1956. And from the 40s through the 70s, tourism becomes bigger and bigger business for Michigan, and the council expresses an increasing amount of interest in politics. They support infrastructure projects and conservation efforts, state park funding. They've got opinions about road signs and billboards and sanitation regulation for hotels. All these decisions coming out of the Capitol that affect how business was running on Mackinac. And the Tourist Council also backed what was to become the greatest change to the Michigan landscape, the Mackinac Bridge. You all knew we were going to get here. At almost 70 years old now, the bridge has become such a landmark. It's kind of easy to imagine that it was inevitable, but it was never a sure thing. For many decades, it was thought to be physically and financially impossible. And its existence is the result of the efforts of many different people who I cannot tell you all about tonight, but we are going to be sharing the contributions of those who worked to make the bridge happen from within the walls of the Capitol. So let's kind of scroll back a little bit because the first idea of creating a permanent crossing at the Straits dates to at least the 1880s. In 1884, an article in the Grand Traverse Tribune was reporting that the railroad ferry, the Algoma, was stuck in the ice yet again, had a reputation for that. And they suggest that the Algoma has had a hard fight for existence and is finally abandoned. Now, shall it be a bridge or a tunnel? Either will mean enormous expense, but both are practicable. And I think it's interesting, this article comes out about a year after the opening of the Brooklyn Bridge in New York, which was considered quite an engineering feat at the time. So I think that maybe that news kind of sparked some interest here in Michigan, and people start looking at the Straits and thinking, oh, maybe we could build something there. The first time state government takes a real interest in the bridge, though, isn't until 1922, about the time when the state ferry service is starting up. It's actually the Department of Agriculture's Development Bureau began an investigation to consider the feasibility of the bridge. And the model that they're considering at the time, it was recommended by a New York engineer, Charles Fowler, and it was actually a set of bridges and causeways. It started in Sheboygan, Michigan, went to Boblo Island, to Round Island, to Mackinac Island, and then to St. Ignace. And the next few years, Governor Greene kind of gets in on the bridge discussion again. He directs the Highway Commission to conduct a similar investigation. And in 1929, the commission comes back and reports, yes, this bridge or bridges could probably be built, but it would cost an estimated $30 million, which according to this Lansing, the State Journal article, is a sum that state officials only whisper about. But a few years later, in 1934, with the Depression going on, the federal government has set up the Public Works Administration to provide funds for large-scale civic construction projects just like this one. And so the legislature, realizing there's some funding to be had here, establishes the first version of the Mackinac Straits Bridge Authority to look into getting a hold of some of this money. And this is where probably the most influential figures in bridge history enters the scene, Prentice Brown. At this point, Brown was in Congress, but for many years, he was a lawyer in St. Ignace. And according to his personal recollection, he became convinced of the necessity of the bridge at the age of 30 when he was trying to catch a train in Mackinac City so he could make it to a scheduled appearance before the state Supreme Court here at the Capitol building. And this was wintertime. And of course, the state ferries were icebound. So he and another hopeful train passenger hire a horse and a cutter to try to get across the ice. They end up running into ice hills that he remembers being 10 feet high. So the horse has to turn around, and he and this other person continue on foot. And after walking through the snow for about 4 miles, they finally make it to Mackinac City. And of course, by that time, they have missed their train. And so in the next few decades, Brown puts in an enormous amount of professional and personal time to getting the bridge built. And today he's often kind of remembered as really like the father of the Mackinac Bridge, really kind of the leader of this effort. So Prentice Brown serves as like the legal advisor to this first bridge authority. And unfortunately, the PWA rejects their first proposal for the bridge funding. So they kind of reformulate the plan. They try again a couple years later. And this time, Prentice Brown teams up with another very famous Michigan Youper, Governor Chase Osborne, former governor at this point. And Osborne kind of suggests that the state should be building the bridge as part of our centennial celebrations, kind of like a birthday present to ourselves upon turning 100. So he crafts a few public letters to various state and federal officials voicing his support. In the little missive you can see here, which is addressed to a Rep. C.E. Mapes, he says, one opponent of the bridge has said that it is unnecessary because there would only be 2 very little villages at either end. The fact is that 1/3 of the state of Michigan is at one end and 2/3 of the state at the other. The Upper Peninsula is really marooned. We need a bridge. So it's clear that a lot of these people who are, supporting the bridge effort, they are not thinking about just connecting St. Ignace and Mackinac Island. They are thinking about connecting the entirety of the Upper and Lower Peninsulas and bringing the state together. Now, unfortunately, the second attempt at PWA funding is also rejected. But in 1939, the state does commit enough funding to construct a causeway in St. Ignace, which would eventually become the far northern end of the bridge. Their kind of reasoning at this point is that before the bridge is finished, we could use that as a ferry dock. That never happens. But it does serve as a nice parking area during the bridge construction. And the causeway probably gets built because by that time, Murray Van Wagner is in office, and he is a former state highway commissioner. So that means he was the one running the ferry service for quite a few years. So he is well aware of the issues at the Straits. He's got a lot of experience with big civic construction like this, and he's convinced that the bridge is the only way forward. Now, unfortunately, World War II interrupts any further construction attempts after the causeway is done. And in 1947, the legislature dissolves the Bridge Authority. But hope is not lost because the following year is when another bridge champion steps in, Soapy Williams. Governor Williams makes the support for the bridge part of his 1948 campaign. And after he takes office, he creates the Interpeninsular Communication Commission with the express purpose of encouraging a greater sense of cooperation between the people of the UP and the LP, notably by getting the bridge built. And Williams, of course, becomes a very powerful, very public advocate for the bridge, but his involvement also incidentally makes the bridge a more partisan issue. Williams was a Democrat, and at this time, the legislature was Republican majority. So over the next few years, most of the Dems in the legislature kind of start to line up behind Williams in support. But a lot of the Republicans, especially those that lived hundreds of miles away from the Straits, they're a bit more reluctant. And all the while, a lot of Northern Michigan people on both sides of the aisle, they're pretty skeptical. By this time, the bridge is a bit of a political football. It gets tossed around anytime someone's trying to get votes in the Upper Peninsula, and then everybody forgets about it. So at this point, there was definitely a need for a little bit of, let's say, bipartisan encouragement of this plan. And that happened to be the perfect job for the president of the Grand Hotel, Stuart Woodfill. And as president of the Grand, as I've explained before, you have a lot of influence. You know everybody at the Capitol, and you can get what you want at the Capitol a lot of the time. And Woodfill happens to be a Republican, and he's a longtime supporter of the bridge idea. So shortly after Williams creates his Interpeninsular Commission, Woodfill organizes the Mackinac Bridge Citizens Committee, fills it with his Republican friends, opens an office in Detroit, and starts printing promotional literature, like what you can see here. And he also starts lobbying at the Capitol building. During the 1950 session, Senator William Ellsworth of St. Ignace introduced a bill to reestablish the Bridge Authority. And they also have support on the House of Representatives side from Speaker Victor Knox, who happened to be from Sault Ste. Marie, very conveniently. But the main roadblock to getting this bill passed was the chair of the State Affairs Committee, William C. Vandenberg of Holland. And Woodfill seems to have made it his personal mission to get Vandenberg to have his committee look at the bridge bill. This all comes to a head in the spring of 1950. Woodfill is staying at the Olds Hotel, gets a visit from Senator Ellsworth, who basically says, like, this isn't going to happen. No one's been able to pressure Vandenberg into hearing the bill. And according to Woodfill, he's so frustrated he cannot sleep that night. So he gets out of bed, fires off a letter to the legislature at large, threatening essentially to hold a press conference lambasting the entire Republican Party for refusing to listen to this bill. So the next day, after reading this letter, Vandenberg gives Woodfill what he wants. They hold a joint session of the State Affairs Committee. They consider the Bridge Authority bill, and in a few weeks, it is passed in both chambers, and Williams signs it on June 6th of 1950. So Williams appoints a bipartisan group to the Bridge Authority. You'll see again some familiar names here. Prentice Brown is back. He heads things up as the chair of the committee. Murray Van Wagner is here, bringing all his road building experience. Also joined by Charles Fisher, who is in the National Bank of Detroit, a GM board member. He evidently brings a lot of connections to like the financial world, which is going to be useful in paying for this project. And the Upper Peninsula is represented by William Cochran of the National Bank of Iron Mountain and George Osborne, who is Chase Osborne's son, and also was the owner of the Sault Ste. Marie Evening News. And so with that position in the media, in the press, he can make sure that the bridge never leaves the front page of the newspapers in the Upper Peninsula. Another notable member of the committee is Lawrence Rubin, who acted as their executive secretary. He's a former officer of the State Highway Department, and he is kind of often the person with sort of feet on the ground at the Capitol building as all these discussions are taking place. And in the following years, kind of becomes like the keeper of the Bridge Authority's story, if you would. He's the one who literally writes the book about it. Now, the authorities' kind of directive is to determine the feasibility of the bridge, look at the site, consider potential natural threats, and most importantly to the state, they have to figure out what it's going to cost and how they're going to pay for it. And they come back reporting that the bridge is probably going to take about $100 million, but they claim that they can be raised primarily through the sale of revenue bonds, which can then be repaid once the bridge is open through tolls. And it's important to remember at this point, the authority does not have the ability to build anything. So a couple years later in 1952, they're all back at the Capitol asking for funds to start finalizing construction plans. To help the argument, they actually bring along a model of the bridge. You can see it here in the House chamber with their speaker, Victor Knox again. And at this point, another kind of roadblock forms in the shape of Highway Commissioner Charles Ziegler, who is adamant that no funding should come out of the Highway Department's budget for this project. He and certain other members of the legislature were convinced this was not an appropriate use of state money, especially after the state had spent millions of dollars on the ferry service through the years. So in the end, this bridge authority is only able to get their money after stripping out any language that would make state agencies responsible for paying for the bridge's construction, its maintenance and repairs, the repayment of the revenue bonds. In the end, they were notoriously given a $1 appropriation just so their bill could be considered an appropriations bill for procedural purposes. But it goes through, and Williams signs off on this in April 1952. So the authority can really start making some real plans. They hire David B. Steinman as chief designer. He also contributes some of his own money to the project. And in 1953, they start kind of lining up the sale of the revenue bonds. At this point, apparently, though, the bond market was not very strong, and they were faced with a lot of skepticism from financial backers who were confused about the purpose of a $100 million bridge between two tiny little towns in the wilds of northern Michigan, and were also concerned about the state government's lack of support for the project. So the Bridge Authority kind of comes up with a plan to sort of firm up their financial options here. At this point, the state was paying about $500,000 every year to maintain the ferry service, which presumably you're not going to need that once a bridge is built. So they realized if you could get the state to commit that money to the maintenance and repair of the bridge in the future, that would mean that all the tolls could be used exclusively to pay back the bondholder. So it kind of strengthens that financial kind of setup. So Prentice Brown, Van Wagner, and Charles Fisher, they all kind of work to get those funds. And the end, their next appropriations bill would give them $417,000 annually at the state's motor vehicle fund after the bridge opened. But it also required them to sell all those bonds by the end of that year, 1953. So they finally have some money lined up, but now, of course, they are on a time crunch, and their bill, along with every other approps bill that year, gets tied up in a feud about taxes. The Republican leadership was trying to get a business activities tax passed that year, and it was one of those situations where they needed every single member of their party to vote for this in order to make it happen. So they're trying to line this support up in their caucus, and a lot of this discussion is happening in the House Republican caucus room, which you can see a later photo of here. And in the spring of 1953, things are kind of coming to a head, and a Rogers City representative named Emil Peltz speaks up and says that he can get the last votes they need for the tax plan as long as they make that bridge authority bill the very next thing that they vote on. And it works. The Republicans get their tax plan and they vote on the bridge appropriation right after that. So the sale of the bonds is scheduled then for December 17th of 1953. Everything's kind of lining up, but there will be one more problem to overcome. On December 16th, 1953, Senator Haskell Nichols, who is a longtime skeptic of the bridge project, files a petition with the Michigan Supreme Court to prohibit the State Administration Board from approving the bond sale. Essentially, his argument is that it's questioning the legality of using those highway funds for this project. Luckily, Apprentice Brown is able to save the day again. He hops in his car, races to Lansing, and has a little meeting with Chief Justice John Dethmers, whose office was then on the third floor of the Capitol building, right next to the Supreme Court room. And this is the kind of thing you can do when you're Prentice Brown, is just walk in and chit-chat with the justices. And he asked if they could please allow the sale of bonds to continue. It says that they won't even see the proceeds till February of the following year. That gives the court plenty of time to consider this petition more carefully. And so the justices agree. They allow the bond sale to continue, and they temporarily deny Nichols' petition, and eventually they rule against him officially. So the very next day, it's December 17th, the members of the Bridge Authority and the State Administrative Board meet in the governor's office for the official sale of the bonds. Checks are signed, bonds are passed over, and the bridge starts to really shift from dream to reality at this point. Construction starts in May 7th, 1954, continues for 3.5 years, and the bridge opens for traffic on November 1st, 1957. And of course, all the members of the Bridge Authority and the governor are there to celebrate. The officials kind of parade out to the middle of the bridge to take some photos, which you can see here, and kind of pose together. And Governor Williams intended to drive the parade car across the bridge and be like the first person to make that official crossing. Unfortunately, he either had let his license expire or he forgot his license entirely that day. So Nancy Williams, First Lady, ends up being the one who's driving the car. You can kind of see her in profile here. Governor Williams, though, does get the honor of paying the first bridge toll. You can see him handing the check off to Prentice Brown. Interestingly, the Bridge Authority did not accept checks. Nobody told the governor that. So as far as I know, he's probably the only one who has ever paid his Mackinac Bridge toll with a check. The following June, the bridge dedication takes place, the big splashy 4-day ceremony. Oldsmobile provides 103 white convertibles to carry dignitaries and special guests across the bridge in a parade. You can see Governor Williams in his white convertible there. U.S. Army and Navy jets fly in formation overhead. And in a very happy ceremony, Prentice Brown and Governor Williams unveil a plaque on the North Acre Block, officially opening things up. But of course, the opening of the bridge does mean the end of the state ferries. You can see Governor Williams putting up the for sale sign on one of the ships here. This does mean the start of another very beloved Mackinac tradition, though. As part of the festivities, the International Walkers Association proposed a walking race over the bridge. Governor Williams did join the walk that year, did not officially race. And the next year, the Bridge Authority decides to hold the event again because it was really popular. They move it to Labor Day, though, to encourage late summer tourism. And Williams participates again in 1959, and he kind of sets the precedent for the governors leading the Labor Day Bridge Walk. And of course, through the years, Mackinac Bridge has become a landmark of Michigan, just as much as the Capitol building is, and a kind of destination unto itself. And like the Capitol, it's featured on all sorts of state literature and souvenirs, commemorative items. And of course, it also graces the ceilings of the House and Senate chambers upstairs. During the restoration, when the ceiling tiles were being replicated, the state held a contest for students in Michigan to design a new skylight panel. The winner was Angie Rowe, who was an 8th grader of Traverse City, who drew a sketch of the Mackinac Bridge. So they executed her drawing in 2 etched glass panels and presented them in a special ceremony in the House chamber in 1990. You can see her there with Governor Engler. And of course, the bridge is also commemorated here in Governor Williams' official portrait painted by John Coppin in 1961. Williams certainly considered the bridge part of his legacy, and it is also indicative of his involvement with the Mackinac area. He supported many of the state parks projects, especially some of their early attempts at historical preservation and interpretation. He and his family spent a lot of time at the governor's summer residence, evidently enjoyed it so much they purchased their own cottage on the West Bluff after he leaves office. And today, Governor Williams is only one of only two governors who is actually interred in the island cemetery. The other is William Milliken, who is also very much an active Mackinac governor. He was actually in office during President Ford's visit and during the bicentennial the following year, the U.S. bicentennial, which is notable as Mackinac's the only American Revolutionary War site in Michigan. Helen Milliken, First Lady, redesigned the gardens at the governor's residence, and she personally appealed to the State Park Commission to get girls to be allowed to take part in the Scout Service Camp in 1973. And today, their son, Bill Milliken Jr., is actually a current member of the Mackinac Bridge Authority. And in 2024, Mackinac State Historic Parks opened a new nature center at Arch Rock on Mackinac Island, named for the former governor. Milliken was known for championing environmental protections in Michigan and was also very supportive of the state parks projects. And this is the time, this kind of 50s through the 1980s, when the state park is really starting to take on more work in history in general. They're doing a lot more restoration and preservation, doing much more to protect the legacy of the area, if you would. In 1959, the park began an archaeological investigation at the site of what is now Colonial Michilimackinac, which is in Mackinac City, just west of the bridge, with the goal of gradually reconstructing the 18th century community that was located there. And around this time, the director of the park at that point, Eugene Peterson, meets a young architect named Richard Frank at a party in East Lansing and ends up hiring him to make the architectural drawings for the reconstruction. Frank continues his work at Mackinac into the 1960s with the restoration of Fort Mackinac on the island. And this is mid-20th century. This is a time when preservation is kind of in its infancy, especially in the Midwest. And Frank becomes one of the first architects in the region to really specialize in preservation projects. He has a very long career in the field. He becomes really known as sort of the godfather of the preservation movement in Michigan. And of course, at this time, when Frank is working on Mackinac in the summer and he's living in the Lansing area in the off season, this is when the capital is really starting to suffer the effects of, let's say, misguided modernizations. This is when the overfloors are going in and things are getting really crowded. In 1965, Frank heads a Michigan Society of Architects committee on the state capitol, basically to offer professional opinions about what to do with this old building. And Frank's report from this committee is one of the earliest arguments for the Capitol's restoration and its continued use by state government. And of course, the discussion continues into the following decades. In 1982, William Milliken appoints Frank to a 14-member committee on the Capitol restoration, which is asked to consider the value, the feasibility of the project. And after a few, preliminary projects, the legislature and the governor's office are finally ready to commit to this full time. And Dick Frank is a natural choice to kind of lead up the restoration. He creates the restoration master plan in 1986-87, which kind of becomes sort of the Bible of the Capitol's preservation. And he is awarded the gold medal from the American Institute of Architects for his work on the Capitol's restoration. And after the building was rededicated in 1992, he serves as the first architect of the Capitol. So he continues to consult and advise on the building's continued preservation. Also maintains connections at Mackinac. Frank managed the restoration of the governor's summer residence in the 1990s. And in my mind, the restoration of the Capitol and its continued preservation, it forms like another link to Mackinac. These are both places now that are recognized for the historical significance. They are where people come in part to learn more about Michigan. And of course, history is always expanding. We all know Mackinac remains as political as ever. These are just a few headlines that I remember seeing this year about goings on at the Straits. I'm sure you can think of some more yourself. And of course, as we continue to learn more about the history of these locations, you find more and more connections in the past. I'm going to end tonight with a little discovery I made while putting this together, which is just one of my favorite stories personally. One of my favorite places to work when I was at Mackinac was the Biddle House on Mackinac Island, named for the Métis family who lived there in the early 19th century. The last surviving child of the Biddle family was a Sarah Durfee, who spent her final years in Lansing. She moved here with her daughter's family sometime between 1900 and 1910, and her son-in-law, Alexander Bath, worked upstairs in the Capitol. He was a clerk for the Secretary of State. And I do not know if Sarah ever visited the Capitol while she was here, but if she did, if she found herself here on a busy day when there are people rushing around trying to get to where they got to go and find the people they're looking for and do whatever it is that they came here to do, I do wonder if it would have reminded her of a busy, bustling summer day on Mackinac Island. Because whether you find yourself in the Capitol's rotunda, or if you're standing on the shore of Lake Huron, looking out across the bridge, you are at a crossroads of Michigan. You're at a place where our people of our state come together, we interact, and we make our history here. All right, so that's all I've got for you tonight. If there are any questions, I'd love to hear them. Yeah.
Comment, you took a picture of Sophie Williams putting for sale sign.
Yes.
Made sure that all the people lost jobs at the ferry got one.
Oh, that's a great story.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. That was a comment. I hadn't heard that. I guess when the state ferries closed up business, Governor Williams made sure that everyone who is employed by the ferries got some work somewhere else. That's very considerate. I have also heard a story, at least in one place, that Williams was, I don't know if he was the very last, but one of the last people to actually like drive the ferry across the straits. He may have had a little trouble bringing it into the dock though. So he didn't miss that opportunity either. Yeah. I do not remember what the very first toll charged on the bridge was. It honestly, I mean, it has increased over the years. It hasn't increased as much as you would expect it to be. I think it was like $1 or $2 maybe. Yeah. And now it's $1.25. Yeah, something like that. And I'm not sure what it is now. $5. Yeah. Yeah. So like it's gone up, but not as much as other things have gone up. Yeah. Okay, yeah.
So what summer were you working on the island?
I was on Mackinac between 2010 and 2014. Yep. And mostly on the island, a few other places, but.
Great agency in California and wanted to see the bridge under construction. So you could rent a ride on motor launch at Mackinac City. Go out and look at Caisson's islands. Now I'm not sure, I have to check with my brother. He's 5 years older, and I would have been about 6 or 7 years old when they were building. But I remember crossing on the ferry several times before the bridge. And I think I remember debarking from someplace other than the middle of St. Ignace. So either they had more than one ferry dock, or maybe there was a big period they actually did use the crosswalk.
Yeah, there may have been. I'm not sure exactly where the docks were located. Yeah, and they may have moved. Yeah, yeah.
One big irony, Michigan finally ponied up the money to build a ferry boat vacation land. And it was launched in '56.
Oh.
Limited icebreaking capabilities. And they have 1 year of service.
That's too bad. Yeah, apparently.
Sold to Stern and Washington for Island. When they got tired of it, it was sold to some interest in Northern Asia. And as it was being told there, it foundered and sank.
Oh, no. Poor ferry boat. Maybe it makes sense then why the highway commissioner at the time was so resistant, because they had just gotten this nice new boat.
ferries.
Mm-hmm. That makes
I
sense.
had a high school teacher who lived in Mackinac. And that was before the state railroad carried converted ferries. And at that time, you had to put your car in a flat car. And then that went on to the railroad carriage across the street.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's neat. Anybody else remember crossing with the ferries? Maybe, I wonder. Yeah,
Always,
yeah.
whitefish hawkers.
Yeah, there was a whole like economy. Yeah, yeah, servicing people waiting in line for the ferries, bringing food and like gas cans and things like that. Yeah.
And up back to Sheboygan.
Mm-hmm. All right. Any other things? Yeah.
Bonds paid off,
What was that?
the bonds were paid off.
Yes, yeah, the final bridge bonds, I think, were paid off in 1986, if I remember correctly. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Anything else? Okay. All right. Well, thanks a lot again for joining us.